Hello, my name is Dídac and this is a video class for the course Literatura Inglesa 2, Ilustración, Romanticismo y Época Victoriana. The main purpose of this video class is to give you a general introduction to Victorian poetry, to make your reading of Victorian poems easier and more productive. These are the aspects that I will be covering. 6 sections, relatively short sections. First, we'll be looking at continuities and discontinuities with Romantic poetry. Then, number 2, we'll be looking at connections between Victorian poetry and the Victorian novel. Number 3, we'll be considering Victorian poetry as a poetry of character and identity. Number 4, the past and the present in Victorian poetry. Number 5, innovative aspects of the poetry of the period. And we will end with a short summary and conclusion. So let's begin with continuities and discontinuities with Romanticism. When the Victorian period begins, when Queen Victoria ascends the throne in 1837, only William Wordsworth was still alive from the canonical Romantic poets. As you know, the poets of the second generation had all died very young. Romanticism, however, had been a veritable revolution, and the main aesthetic shift it had introduced, a subjective approach to experience, was still prevalent, and in many ways we could say that it is still prevalent today. Romanticism changed poetry forever, we could say. One of the strongest influences on the Victorian poet Robert Browning has to do with subjectivity and also with idealism. One of the strongest influences on Browning was Shelley's idealism. Most of the themes that had interested Romantic poets, for example, freedom, the appeal of the past, the relationship between nature, the subject, and God, all these themes continued to inspire Victorian poets. And we could think of a late Victorian poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, even though in some respects his work is considered to prefigure 20th century poetry. He is still a very Victorian poet and in many ways a Romantic poet, because his treatment of nature, connecting it with imagination and the inner self, is essentially Romantic. Perhaps the most striking difference between the mentalities of the Romantic and the Victorian periods is the Victorian, what we could call the Victorian uneasiness with passion, which, as you will remember, is a typically Romantic notion. The Victorians prioritized other notions like self-control or duty. And the early Victorian writer Thomas Carlyle dismissed the Romantics, especially the last Romantics, Byron for instance, and preferred earlier, even pre-Romantic referents. If we associate Romanticism with revolution, the Victorian age is characterized by very sensible, controlled, rational reform. So revolution versus reform. The poetry of the Victorian period, therefore, can be considered an expression of attenuated or toned down Romanticism. The feeling of melancholy prevails over romantic passion, and the best example of this is the work of one of the most famous and popular poets of the period, Tennyson. His work is characterized by a melancholy mood. Okay, so this was a short introduction to Victorian poetry. Now we move on to Victorian poetry as opposed to or in connection with the Victorian novel. The novel became the dominant genre during the Victorian period. It was perfected as a literary form. It became increasingly sophisticated, reaching very high standards. It was also mass-produced. It was also a lucrative form of literature, and it was marketed very successfully. Victorian poets wrote conventional short lyrics, as the Romantics did, but they also embarked on very ambitious poetic projects. And these long, often narrative or philosophical poems resembled contemporary novels in their ambitious length, structure, and scope. And I will give you three examples, three key poems of the period. The first one is Tennyson's In Memoriam, which was an elegy dedicated to his deceased friend Arthur Hallam. It deals poetically with bereavement, as any elegy would do, but at the same time it also deals with a variety of other topics at the center of Victorian debate. Religion and religious doubt, for instance, or social and social changes, scientific discoveries, and so on. It is, we could say, an encyclopedic poem in its scope. The second example is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, which has been defined as a novel in verse. It conforms to the structure of the Bildungsroman, which was a common sub-genre of 19th century fiction. The Bildungsroman, or perhaps more specifically the Künstlerroman, since the poem narrates the life of an artist since childhood, the life of a woman who aspires to become an artist. The subject matter of Aurora Leigh reflects the so-called woman question, which, as you know, was a key debate during the Victorian period, a debate about a women's personal and social fulfillment. And my third example is Browning's The Ring and the Book, Robert Browning's The Ring and the Book, which is a murderous and eventful narrative set in Renaissance Italy, where the poet shows his mastery in using narrative point of view. So the story is presented from multiple and complementary perspectives, and this is very innovative and at the same time reproduces the model of the great Victorian novels. Right, so now we'll consider the fascination obvious in Victorian poetry, the fascination with character. One of the strengths of Victorian poetry, which may combine the lyrical, the narrative, and also the dramatic, is the portrayal of character. Popular examples are Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott and a shorter poem, Mariana, which present two female characters and their tragic destinies. In both cases, Tennyson uses the device of identifying character with spatial setting. In Mariana, her feeling of loneliness, her yearning for death, correspond visually with the setting, with the decayed house, the lonely moated grange. This is a phrase that recurs in the poem. This house and also the surroundings, the waste environment. Descriptive and evocative details about the surroundings are combined with Mariana's own voice as she laments her destiny and repeats, "I would that I were dead," at the end of each stanza. But the poet who best represents the Victorian fascination with character, identity, and psychology is Browning. For several years, he wrote for the stage, and he then incorporated his experience as a dramatist, as a playwright, to the development of a poetic subgenre, the dramatic monologue. So the following are the traits of the dramatic monologue. The first person is used, but it cannot be identified with the poets. It is obviously the voice of a character. It conveys a vivid impression of the personality of the character, the main speaker. There is often an audience, which can be anonymous or can be another character, more or less recognizable. It can be one person, it can be several people, and this audience is addressed by the speaker. However, the auditor or auditors do not speak. They do not express themselves. And finally, the speech situation is often relevant in characterizing the speaker. These then would be the characteristics, defining traits of the dramatic monologue, as used by Browning. In Browning's dramatic monologues, it is often the case that the main character conceals or does not make important information explicit, so that readers are expected to fill in gaps. This happens in My Last Duchess, which is perhaps Browning's most perfect dramatic monologue. Here, the Duke tells his guest how his wife used to smile at other men, and then declares, "This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together." These words, these lines from the poem, apart from characterizing the Duke as jealous and aggressive, allow readers to deduce what might have happened, what the Duke might have done to his wife. The next section is called The Past and the Present. And we will consider an important Victorian debate which addressed the question of which were the most suitable topics, the most suitable subject matters for poetry. On the one hand, those who considered that poetry had to find inspiration in a heroic mythical past, and on the other, those who claimed that poetry could not overlook the problems of contemporary life, very much as the novel was doing. If you think, for example, of the Condition of England novel that concerned itself with the undersides of industrialization. So some poets thought that poetry should do the same or something comparable. This controversy is exemplified by the work of two key poets of the period, Tennyson and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her name often being abbreviated to EBB, as you can see here. Tennyson admitted his passion for the past. He was fascinated with the Arthurian legend, as poems like The Lady of Shalott or Idylls of the King show. In this last work, a very ambitious and long poem, however, the presence of the past does not represent an escape from the present, since connections can be established between the Arthurian legend and Victorian England. Certain episodes contain more or less subtle allusions to the poets and the readers present. And then we have Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who represents the other side of the controversy. She defended that poets should be concerned with the issues of their age rather than looking back on the past and idealizing it. As I explained earlier, Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh daringly explores the difficulties faced by women aspiring to become artists in the 19th century. She does so in a very direct way. Another female poet, Christina Rossetti, also explores the woman question, but in a more subdued way. But Barrett Browning does it very daringly and directly, as I said. Not only the situation of women, but other aspects of social injustice in Victorian England. The last section, before we come to our conclusion, is Victorian poetry and innovation. I began by commenting on connections between Romantic and Victorian poetry, mainly continuities, some discontinuities as well. An important innovation has to do with language, with poetic language. In his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth had put forward that the revolutionary idea that poetry should be written in what he called the language of men. In other words, he didn't think that poetry should use a special, more sophisticated, more obscure language. Victorian poets like Browning or Hopkins were also against the use of poetic language that they considered artificious. They were against artificiality in poetic language. Browning's style is spontaneous and forceful, close to the cadences of prose. In his time, Browning's style was considered harsh, it was considered unpoetic, but nowadays this view has changed and it is considered a decisive contribution towards linguistic renovation in poetry. And then we have Hopkins, who also struggled to reproduce the rhythm of natural speech in poetry, which led to his development of what he called sprung rhythm. Sprung rhythm was an alternative to accentual syllabic verse, prevailing in the post-Renaissance tradition of English poetry, and represented by poets like Tennyson, by contemporary Victorian poets like Tennyson. Hopkins found these patterns constraining as well as unnatural, and he came up with a different rhythm, the sprung rhythm. So let's go through the formal characteristics of sprung rhythm. created by Hopkins. It is accentual, the rhythm is accentual, not accentual syllabic, only accentual, which means that it is determined by accents and their placement within the line, regardless of the number of syllables. It does not require lines to have equal length or a fixed number of syllables. It prefers feet that begin with accented syllables, the trochee and not the iamb, which is so common in English poetry. So the trochee, the dactyl, the paean are the feet that are favored by Hopkins. Stressed and unstressed syllables do not alternate predictably, as we would find in iambic pentameters, the most conventional poetic lines in English poetry. Consecutive syllables may be stressed, which is relatively unusual in English poetry. There is a distinction between stress and grade stress, and Hopkins even marks sometimes grade stresses using the graphic accent, as you have in Spanish and other Romance languages. So stresses, single stresses, are those we would normally place on certain words in everyday speech, and grade stresses, on the other hand, mark special emphasis, and they are normally followed by an unstressed syllable and a pause. These unaccented segments within the line Hopkins called outrights. Sprung rhythm also often resorts to alliteration in imitation perhaps of Anglo-Saxon verse, also of Welsh poetry, which he was familiar with. And alliteration, as you know, means that within the same line, syllables which are stressed begin with the same sounds. And finally, Hopkins's sprung rhythm relies on compounds, also on the omission of connecting words, which makes the placement of accents easier. So the sprung rhythm is not easy to scan, but it is easy to perceive in a good reading. For instance, in the Norton Anthology, you will find examples of Hopkins's sprung rhythm scanned, and also in websites like the Poetry Foundation, you may find readings of Hopkins's poems, which will allow you to perceive a very strong and very marked rhythm. So sprung rhythm is an important innovation in the sense that it prefigures free verse, which will come to its full development in 20th century poetry. It was admired by poets like Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot, Robert Lowell, and in a similar way, Browning's dramatic monologue and his poem The Ring and the Book, which I mentioned earlier, foreshadow the interior monologue and perspectivism of modernist fiction. So as you can see, several elements of Victorian poetry connect with the literature of the 20th century. And finally, we come to our conclusion. There is an aspect which we haven't discussed in length, and that is religion, and I have included it here. Religion was a key element of Victorian poetry. It is very present, for example, in the poems of Christina Rossetti, who was a very devout Christian. And we have the presence of religion ranging from religious doubt in Tennyson, for example, and this religious doubt we could relate to the crisis of Darwinism in religion, and also solid faith. I've just mentioned Christina Rossetti, her poem Uphill, for example, or Hopkins, of course, God's Grandeur, for instance. I would also like to mention other important Victorian poets whom we haven't mentioned so far. Matthew Arnold, Emily Bronte, who, as well as a great novelist, was also a great poet. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was a poet and also an artist, as you may know, the leader of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or Algernon Charles Swinburne. The main aspects I have covered in this video lecture have been how Victorian poetry connects with and departs from Romantic poetry. We have also considered in what ways Victorian poetry resembles the Victorian novel. We have also talked about the fascination with character, with psychology in Victorian poetry. We have briefly discussed how Victorian poetry recreates the past and also how it deals with contemporary reality and how sometimes it does both things simultaneously. And finally, we have gone through some of its innovative elements. And these are some of the key words or key concepts that you should bear in, that you should remember. Subjectivity, melancholy, verse novel, Bildungsroman, Künstlerroman, woman question, point of view, character, dramatic monologue, and sprung rhythm. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.